So if, as Moy argues, Showalter's expectations of Woolf, that she provide an authentic account of women's experience, is complicit in the very ideology to which feminism purports to be in opposition, what do we then make of Woolf? If Showalter has missed the point, if Stubbs has missed the point, if Hawley has missed the point, then what do we do? Do feminists, as Moy asks, have an alternative to this negative reading of Woolf, and then also a way to answer or address this complicity or this potential complicity between a certain expectation of some feminist critics and theorists, a potential complicity of those critics and theorists with patriarchy itself. In her, I think, second or third section of her introduction to sexual textual politics, Showalter addresses these questions by bringing Woolf to various theorists, first to Jacques Derrida, then to Sigmund Freud, and then to Julia Kristeva, who's something of a postmodern or post-structuralist psychoanalytic feminist. So composing all of those quote-unquote approaches together. It might be worthwhile reading just a few more passages from Moy's article and talking alongside it as I read through it, just so we can get a real flavor for, and just so I don't screw up summarizing or describing Moy's arguments, or the way in which she attempts to address the questions I asked at the beginning. On page 9 of her chapter, Moy writes, quote, Showalter wants the literary text to yield the reader a certain security, a firm perspective from which to judge the world. Woolf, on the other hand, seems to practice what we might now call a deconstructive form of writing, one that engages with and thereby exposes the duplicitous nature of discourse. In her own textual practice, remember the very thing that Showalter claims we may want to take some distance, from which we may want to take some distance as in order to best judge Woolf's feminism. In her own textual practice, Moy argues, Woolf exposes the way in which language refuses to be pinned down to an underlying essential meaning. And at the end of the paragraph on that page, mostly because I don't want to refresh our memories on Jacques Derrida, it is in the light of such textual and linguistic theory, such as that of Derrida, that we can read Woolf's playful shifts and changes of perspective, especially in Mrs. Dalloway, although she doesn't say that here, in both her fiction and in A Room of One's Own, as something rather more than a willful desire to irritate the serious-minded feminist critic. We might think that it is actually an attempt to irritate patriarchy, though. Though her conscious exploitation of the sportive, that is, Woolf's conscious exploitation of the sportive sensual nature of language, she rejects the metaphysical essentialism underlying patriarchal ideology which hails God, the Father, or the phallus as its transcendental signified. Remember, for Derrida, the transcendental signified is the thing that to which we the thing that we project as the very ground of our stable meanings, right? For instance, God. If we're thinking about the Bible, for instance, a very specialized text, thinking about the Bible in certain modes of Christianity, or in certain explanations of Christianity and its relationship to that book, God, if it's truly God's word and God inspired, then God operates as the sort of security or the grounding according to which we can trust the language of that text as being true and good and righteous and divinely inspired, right? So outside of religion, there's still that idea of a transcendental signified that kind of grounds and secures meaning. And according to Moy, Derrida is not the only one who's ever challenged all transcendental signifieds. According to her, Woolf's very practice of language also does the same thing. Okay. What does that have to do with feminism, though? Okay. At the bottom of page 10, she continues, "It is in this sense that Showalter's recommendation to remain detached from the narrative strategies of the text is equivalent to not reading it at all. For it is only through an examination of the detailed strategies of the text, that is, of Woolf's novels, of A Room of One's Own, of Three Guineas, on all its levels, that we will be able to uncover some of the conflicting contradictory elements that contribute to make it precisely this text, and not that text, not a modernist text, not a realist text, right? With precisely these words and this configuration. Right? The humanist desire for a unity of vision or thought, that would be also the new critic's desire for a unity of vision or thought, is in effect a demand for a sharply reductive reading of literature. A reading that, not least in the case of an experimental writer like Woolf, can have little hope of grasping the central problems posed by pioneering modes of textual production. A non-contradictory perception of the world for Lukács's Marxist opponent Bertolt Brecht is precisely a reactionary one." She follows this up with a few paragraphs about Julia Kristeva. I'm going to refrain from reading those to you now. I would, of course, be happy to talk about Kristeva in a meeting or in class if you'd like to raise a question, although we only have one more class. We had class last night. If you turn to page 12 then, so you see we're bouncing around. After summarizing Kristeva's position, she writes on 12, Moy writes, "It is evident that for Julia Kristeva, it is not the biological sex of a person, but the subject position he or she takes up that determines their revolutionary potential." What does that mean? Let's keep reading. "Her views of feminist politics reflect this refusal of biologism and essentialism." We spoke a little bit about this in terms of race yesterday, right? "The feminist struggle," she argues, "must be seen historically and politically as a three-tiered one, which can be schematically summarized as follows. 1. Women demand equal access to the symbolic order, that is, to culture, right? Liberal feminism, equality, or in other words, really what is the project of first and second wave feminism. 2. Women reject the male symbolic order in the name of difference, radical feminism, femininity extolled, right? So this would be another form of second wave feminism, we might say. Okay. 3, and this is Kristeva's own position, and we might surmise it's also Moy's, and also, oddly enough, though Woolf was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, Woolf's position. Right? Women reject the dichotomy between masculine and feminine as metaphysical. That is to say, as constructed, and constructed in such a way that it becomes naturalized, right? It becomes naturalized as outside the purview of empirical investigation or doubt. Okay. Skipping to page 13, Moy continues. "The relationship between the second and the third positions here requires some comment." Right. So the second position, women reject the male symbolic order in the name of difference, radical feminism, femininity extolled. And the third position, women reject the dichotomy between masculine and feminine as metaphysical. Right. If the defense of the third position implies a total rejection of stage 2, which I do not think it does, this would be a grievous political error. We might take this as saying that Moy is not, if Moy, as I think she means us to understand here, if Moy is understanding Showalter's position to be the position of stage 2 there, her own position and Woolf's position and Kristeva's position does not amount to a wholesale or whole-scale rejection of Showalter's project, right? That would be silly, a grievous error, grievous political error, as Moy points out. "For it still remains politically essential," she continues, "for feminists to defend women as women, in order to counteract the patriarchal oppression that precisely despises women as women. But an undeconstructed form of stage 2 feminism unaware of the metaphysical nature of gender identities, or the constructed nature of gender identities, runs the risk of becoming an inverted form of sexism. It does so by uncritically taking over the very metaphysical categories set up by patriarchy in order to keep women in their places, despite attempts to attach new feminist values to these old categories. An adoption of Kristeva's deconstructed form of feminism, therefore, in one sense leaves everything as it was. Our positions in the political struggle have not changed, but in another sense radically transforms our awareness of the nature of that struggle. Right? So let's just keep reading. Skipping to the bottom of the page. It is in this context, right, in the context of the third position and the second position working together, of a Showalter and a Moy working together, Moy's call that Showalter and Woolf work together, right? It is in this context that we must situate Woolf's crucial concept of androgyny. This is not, as Showalter argues, a flight from fixed gender identities, but a recognition of their falsifying metaphysical nature. Far from fleeing such gender identities because she fears them, Woolf rejects them because she has seen them for what they are. She has understood that the goal of the feminist struggle must precisely be to deconstruct the death-dealing binary oppositions of masculinity and femininity. So in other words, not simply, what a stupid way to put it, not to only extol femininity, not only to fight for equality between men and women in culture, not only those things, not only the fight against injustice, not only the fight against the inadequacy of the symbolic order or culture or our politics or our laws, right? But a much more radical, theoretical, but also practical challenge to the way in which we so naturally assume the given categories of masculinity and femininity. Many of the theorists Parker goes over in his chapter on feminism, whether it be Judith Butler or someone else, or Éric Girey, or Hélène Cixous, what have you, or if it's Kristeva, that part of what they attempt to do, according to Moy, is precisely what Woolf was doing at the beginning of the 20th century, or in the early decades of the 20th century, certainly the 20s, but also the 30s. Okay. That in her own fights, and in her own accounts of, as Woolf puts it, translating politics into her own tongue, part of that project was the perpetual dismantling of the binary oppositions, although she didn't call binary oppositions, but nevertheless the very dismantling of the vocabulary of the words of the discourses that we politically and ethically rely on in order to defend, right, our symbolic order. So Moy doesn't do it here, but she calls, in short, not for a distancing from Woolf's text, right, but a very incredibly close engagement with how the operation of the text themselves, their experiments, the way their language works, the shifting perspectivism, the very features that annoy Showalter and other critics, that it's the very attention to those things as not only aesthetic, not only artful, not only literary, but political. That those operations are part of a politics, right? A sexual textual politics. And an account of that politics, Moy is arguing in 1985, has yet to be written. And there are many scholars who still claim that that account has yet to be written. Okay. All right, so when, in the next video, which I think will be the last one, I'm going to read some passages from Mrs. Dalloway, not really interpret them, but just sort of read them suggestively, I guess, to try to point out the ways in which, although Woolf's novel may not offer us a stable, authentic account of women's experience, although it doesn't necessarily let us in on the everyday lives, both public and private, of women. Nevertheless, at the level of text, at the level of thought, at the level of its own practice, is unpacking and unfolding both a critique of what Moy calls the symbolic order, and also at the same time attempting to forge some exits from that order. Although that's claiming quite a bit. I'm not sure I can live up to that. But regardless, at the very least, in the next video, I'll be reading some passages from Mrs. Dalloway. Okay.